the session. Joris, I'm not going to, just go.
So, hi everybody, my name is Joris Dormans. I'm with a company called Motion, and we're working on a dungeon crawler, roguelike, or roguelite, whatever you want, type game. And I've been asked to talk a little bit about the generative process that we're doing there, because it's something that came up fairly recently, a thing that I like to call cyclic dungeon generation, which is pretty cool and pretty awesome and gets very good results. So, but allow me to talk a little bit about the game first, so you have a very good idea of what we're trying to do. The game, it's called Unexplored. It follows the classic rogue premise. So you're this dude. In this case, you're a weird yellow character, and you're going down into the dungeons of doom, trying to retrieve the amulet of Yendor, and then you have to make your way back up again. However, where the game departs from the classic rogue-like structure is that it's real time. And because it's real time, there's all these interesting things that are changing, and also that also affects the levels that you're going to generate. For example, there's real-time combat, and that's actually a fun thing, because that's emergent gameplay, and emergent gameplay always works very well if you're generating stuff, because you don't have to mind the quality of the things you generate, because the emergent gameplay will sort that for you. So yeah, there's a lot of fun. There's a lot of creatures and things that you can actually make a pretty big mess out of these things. So it's on the one hand, it's a melee-based dungeon crawling game, real time. That in itself is a lot of fun, but it's also a game that's all about exploration. So I drew a lot of inspiration from classic Zelda games. It's something of a theme here, and I guess in these three talks that are next to each other. And if you look at classic Zelda dungeons, there is more than just the combat. It's also about exploration. It's a lot about different types of lock and key puzzles. So, so the thing that I'm trying to generate, the levels that I'm going to build, they're more. They're not the big sprawling things that you might expect from roguelikes. They're more. They're actually a little bit smaller, and actually keep making them smaller as I go along, because I think somehow I think that smaller levels are more interesting, and they have a different structure. So there's locks and key puzzles in different disguises. So there's actual locks and keys, but there's levers. There is items like a horn of blasting that you can actually use as a key to unlock particular doors and blast your way through walls. And the level generator has to cope with all these things. And if you think about this for a little while, you can probably see the complexity of the thing that I'm trying to handle, because you have to go back down, you have to go back up again. I don't know why I did that to myself, but it makes it a lot more complex. Because you can skip levels. There's chasms you can fall down into a random point in the level, and then all of a sudden you're in a generated level with lock and key puzzles. And that means that all the lock and key puzzles, they have to be, you have to be able to solve them in two directions. You don't naturally have a level flow that starts at one point and it has a nice progression to another point. So there is, and that's actually a sort of fun, because if you do fall down a level, that creates a lot of tension, because there is. You might end up at a very bad spot, where you might actually end up with the boss of that level, and you might not be prepared. But there's a lot to it. So what I'm trying to do is using a pretty sophisticated dungeon generator that I'm going to explain, and that dungeon generator is actually doing things with cycles a lot, because I found that cyclic level structures are much more interesting than the common thing that we see, which are more following a branching tree trajectory and then make cycles out of that. The thing that I'm trying to change is to really make levels that sort of feel like they're handcrafted. And obviously, yeah, I can go on forever. There's a lot of things that the generator can do. There's a lot of themes that are active. They're not as interesting as Emily's themes. They're just boring fire, water things. I might change that in the future, because that's a good thing. But it helps to diversify all these things, and so you can see there is different types of levels that you can encounter, and there's many. But one thing that I found is one of the reasons I'm going for smaller levels these days, is that actually if a level has particular themes, but not too many, a little bit what you said, don't do too many surprising things in one sentence. It's also don't do too surprising things in one level. You can actually have pretty cool levels. So I like this level. There's a huge lake of lava with a dragon in the middle, and there's ways of going around it. And I'm still getting surprised by my own generator in that way, because sometimes the generator throws back stuff at me that I think that they're wonderful. They never thought of putting this in there. So this is a particular combination of themes. There's many chasms. All the rooms are rooms, so there's no tunnels. And there's teleporters connecting the rooms, and then you end up with something weird like this, where actually running through this level is quite a challenge. But it's fun and interesting. So this game is out on Steam, and I'm getting responses back, and we also send the game out to journalists and YouTubers, and people are really picking up on the quality of the level generation. So one of the responses that I got that I feel kind of proud about is by a website called Defunct Games, which is a very critical website. They're not above saying something when something is bad. One thing that they said in the video that it made that makes me personally proud is that they said they would have believed it if we told them that the levels were made by one of our programmers and not one of our designers, which is, I think, is a victory in itself. So, as I said, the thing that we sort of changed, or the thing that was new for us to actually get to this point, was the realization that actually, if you look at many content generations, they sort of their main the most prime structure is a path, right? So most content generation, if you look at Broke, for example, and there's some the things that you look online, if they generate a level, they start at a random point, they add rooms to it, and that creates a tree, and then sometimes they look for interesting ways. If there's two rooms next to each other, they actually sort of put a door in there to make sure that you don't have this endless backtracking. So they try to put in cycles, but the basic structure is still a tree-like structure. Whereas the generator that we're working with does do things a little bit differently. So one thing that I do is, if I start a level and I have a start point and maybe a thing that I want you to reach in that level, maybe a key or a boss character, I always make sure there is not one path connecting the two, but there's two. One is designated as the path towards the goal, and one is designated as the path, the return path. That might change at a later stage, but still it's important to have these two things, and actually you can nest them and combine them in different ways that actually creates a completely different structure. And that structure is, I find, much more interesting and creates much more fluent gameplay than what you would have if you do the branching trees with basically random cycles in there. And this is actually taking the cycles as the main structure for the generation. This idea came out of a different workshop than we had yesterday. It was a workshop in Canada where we did a one-day jam creating generators for parks, and we were looking up different theories of urban landscaping, and actually also looking at theories for hypertext to see what sort of design patterns we could use and to put into the generator to create these interesting parks that you might want to have a walk in. And one thing that really struck was that we found this idea that if you have cycles in the routes that you can follow, the park all of a sudden gets more interesting. So this is what we did doing that thing, and there's a lot of things. There's sort of cycles around different types of landscapes. There's a cycle around a lake, and there might be a weenie, a point that you recognize. And this worked really well. And when I got back from this workshop, I started to notice that these cycles are really, really profound structure. So, for example, I have a daughter who's 3 years old, and if she explores space, she likes to run in cycles. So a field is boring, but if there's a field with a table in it, she likes to run around the table. This is actually something that happened just 2 days after I got off the plane. And there's also a friend's house whose main attraction is that you can make figure eights running around that house, and she can do that endlessly. So I thought there's something very, very basic, something very primordial about cycles that captures our attention. And then I started looking at dungeon maps, not generated ones, but handcrafted ones. And I started noticing that the best maps, they do also have all these interesting cycles. So if you play Dungeons and Dragons, it's often much more interesting to have these dungeons where there might have been a shortcut or there might have been a secret room that you found. And people, human designers are very, very good at creating these cycles at all the right places. And somehow I wanted to see if I could capture that quality. And one thing that I found is very interesting about these cycles is that it also reminded me about a thing that Shigeru Miyamoto once said in an interview. And he said that if he makes games, he wants the player to grow as opposed to a character in the game to grow. So he's not really interested in RPGs because that's just a spreadsheet where your strength might go up, whereas he's interested in making a game where the player is learning new things. And this cyclic structure is actually foregrounding this growth in a very interesting and profound way. In a way that if you in a dungeon and you you make your way through, you find something special, something that makes you more powerful. How are you ever going to notice unless at one point you go back to the place where you were before and face the same enemies, but now it's easier. This is something very, very important that I realized that sort of makes this a very powerful structure. So how do we go about implementing all these things? And this is where I'm getting a little bit technical. And well, grammars we've been talked about grammars a little bit before, but basically I'm using transformational grammars to create all these things. So grammar structures, very quickly, you could have simple rules such as if there's two rooms next to each other, I can put a key in one room and lock the other room. And then maybe if there's a room with a key opposed to another room, I can effectively move that key to the other room, so that sort of is a sort of grammar representation of locking one door and then hiding the key. Traditional grammars, transformational grammars, are working on strings, on text, but I apply the same things to graphs and tiles using a tool called Ludoscope. And if you're interested, you can Google this article I wrote a few years back that sort of lays the groundwork for the things that I'm still doing. So these transformational grammars, so you can imagine there is a couple of rules that you say, well, I'm going to replace a dungeon for a room and a goal. The goal might be a dragon that has the amulet of Yendor, and this you can see this will create a sort of string representation of what the dungeon might be like. But one of the problems that that you might have if you just run this thing, there's no way to control to make sure how many rooms you're going to end up with, because that's sort of open-ended. So it sometimes can be very difficult to control. So if you in this case start with just the dungeon, what will be the output? There's no way of knowing. So to harness those grammars, one thing that I do is keep grammars under control by using sort of recipes that sort of specify, okay, if I'm going to make a dungeon, start with this tile, iterate this rule once, iterate another rule once, and maybe I like to use dice notation. Roll 3 two-sided dice, add them together, and then execute the rule to grow that many times. So you get an interesting number between 3 and 6 with interesting random distributions. And then maybe execute the rules for the enemies, because I don't know how many enemies there will be at that point. Just keep executing until it's gone. And this is something that is important. However, this is not just one big grammar I'm using. That would be too big. I'm using a lot of grammars actually, dividing up this step into a multi-step generation process using Ludoscope. This is Ludoscope, a screenshot from that tool, and every circle on there is an individual grammar that gets executed basically on the output of the thing that goes before. and that actually there are cycles in there as well, so it can actually send back things to a previous state in the generations process. And this is highly inspired by model-driven engineering and software engineering, where the idea is that you try to create every step in the process in such a way that it makes sense by its own right. So everything is a valid transformation. The input has to be meaningful, and the output has to be sort of meaningful. And there's a lot of intermediate steps, and that's actually pretty useful. And it's important that you realize that this means that the grammars I'm using are transformational and not generative. So there's a lot of talk about generative grammars, and that has all the problems of spiraling out of control. Whereas here, my typical grammars, there's only one generative grammar, and that's the one that starts, and that's actually not doing very interesting things. It's all the transformations and the input and the things that get passed on from one step to another. So if you look at how that works under the hood in the game, this is just a couple of slices of the dungeon as it is being generated. It's smaller than a typical dungeon, but basically what I start with is an initial graph. It solves a lot of problems to make sure that if I generate the graph after later, if I have to translate the graph into a tile structure, that there is already some sort of geographic information there. So I start with a graph, sort of plot a mission onto it, onto that graph, things that you need to do, where the keys are, which doors are locked, and then translate that into tiles, blow that up, and decorate that. That is basically the structure. But it's important to know, I'm not going to go into the tile map generation. I want to go into detail about this part of the structure where the dungeon and as it's being generated is still to a certain level abstract and conceptual. And this is where I apply the cycles. So I'm using graph grammars to create the cycles. And grammar rules looks like something like this. So you have a piece of a graph which you can look for and replace with another piece, and there is numbers in there to make sure that you can map one node in the graph to another node in the graph on both of the left and the right hand side of the rules. So as I said, basically what I said just before, if I start creating a dungeon, the thing that I do is if I have to connect a starting point to a goal, I always make sure that there is two routes connecting them. So this is basically a starting point. And another rule might be that if there is a goal and there's something following it, I can have a sort of locked door there and generate the key in the room next to each other. This is a sort of an implementation of a general design rule that you typically want to encounter the door before you want to find the key. That's more interesting design-wise, and this rule captures that thing pretty well. And there might be a very simple rule that says, well, if I have two things following each other, I can put something in between, so I can actually grow this cycle. So you can imagine that these three rules collaborating can create a very simple cyclic structure like this, where you start at a point, you make your way through the dungeon, find the locked door, make your way, continue on your way, find the key, make your way back to the starting point, and then you realize, okay, now I can get past this goal. So that's basically how this generative system works. Except that if you look at real levels, it gets a little bit more complicated, but not by much. But it's the same type of same type of structures, and there's locks and keys. There is obstacles that you can put in. I work with windows as well. Sometimes I break up a cycle. For example, if the goal is very far towards the end of the cycle, then it's interesting to have a starting point, put a window in there so that you can actually reveal the goal, and then leave it to the player to see if they can find a way. That's an interesting pattern that you could use. So there's different implementation of that. And what's also important is that I like to, at this point, I don't really care what a lock and a key might be. They're abstract representations at this stage. So a key might be a lever, might be a real key, might be a sword to defeat an enemy. It might be a potion that will make you immune for fire and allows you to cross other things. And it's interesting to play around. I'm really interested in the structural roles at this stage. Now, what I found is that once I got this system up and running, I found that a lot of interesting design patterns were very easily expressible using these cycles. So this is a slightly more abstract representation of that. So for example, if I have a cycle somewhere, and the A is the path towards the goal and B is the return path, and if A is long and B is long, there's interesting ways of using things. So for example, if both are long, I can make that two alternative paths to the same goal and diversify the themes of that path. So one might be, there might be a lot of fights, and the other might have a lot of traps, and they're sort of, and then it's automatically balanced because both paths are more or less equally long. But also, what I can do is this one is something I use a lot. So there's a valve, so basically one directional door, so you can't go back. So you have to make your way to the lock. You can see the key, but it's behind the valve. So you grab the key, and then sort of you have to find your way back to the starting point, and then make your way to the door again. So there's different types of patterns and things that you can use there. But on the other hand, if the path over is long, so A is long and B is short, there's different interesting things you can do. For example, if the return path is short, I can actually reverse that and put there a secret door in there. It's actually a very good place for a secret door that would allow the player that is actually exploring a lot or has the ability to find a secret door with an instant reward that you can skip a part of the level that might have been dangerous otherwise. You can also say, well, I'm going to do a high risk, low reward, high reward structure. So make the short part. I put a lot of monsters in there, make it actually real dangerous, and give the player an interesting choice whether or not to go the long way round with whatever that means for the game, or find a path that has many monsters, and make your way through that. That's something that you give the player an interesting choice there. And also, I like this one. That you have to sort of, I call it a dramatic cycle, where you reveal the goal. I talked about it just before. On the other end, if A is short and B is long, there's other things you can do. For example, you can do a lock and key cycle where you quickly find the lock, and it takes a while for you to find the key. But once you found the key, actually the path back to the lock is not too far, so you don't. This reduces backtracking a little bit. One that I also found interesting, because in my game you have to go back up again. It works in this case. What if the goal is very close, but the path behind you is destroyed? So you found the goal now, but you're sort of trapped, and you have to find another way back to where you're gone. So that's interesting treasure. You can also set back the player in an interesting way, so you can. Find the goal quickly, but there's a visible reward just a little bit ahead. But if you go for it, you're trapped in, and you have a similar structure. And then there's one more case in this case, and you have, for example, where both A and B are short, and there can be different types of patterns. And this is by no means a complete list of things that I've thought of. There's more things I'm using. But for example, if you have a very short cycle, it would be interesting to just be able to go anywhere and have a dangerous monster patrol that cycle, and that will always give you another way to go about it. You can have a short lock and key for simple things. That's probably a little bit for variety. I like this one too as a gambit, so you make sure there's a visible reward somewhere, and then lure the player to a place that he might not be. You might not have wanted to go otherwise. Interestingly enough, these cycles, and there's so many more, and they combine in interesting ways. And also, I can use this in the dungeon generator to actually create more interesting and bigger plans. To give an example, a final example for this talk, sort of a key item cycle. If you well, if you've played a Zelda game before, then you probably have an idea of what a key item is. In this case, it would be an important quest item that functions as a key as well, so it can unlock particular doors. So sometimes, so the dungeon I generate is planned ahead. So sometimes I know that at level 6 I will put a key item that will allow you to unlock a door at level 5, which I previously generated, but that can take you down to level 7. So that sort of breaks the linear structure of the game. And if I do so, then level 6, where the key item is, I can the main cycle that I put in there would be very interesting to put at a key item cycle where I have these themed locks which will be opened by the key item in this case. At the starting point there's already immediately a themed lock there, and there might be another themed lock leading into a bonus section, or actually the place where you need to go to continue. And then you trap the player in a very small place with the key item and another themed lock. There might also be a mini-boss. If it would be a true Zelda game, there should be a mid-level mini-boss at that point as well to show you. So you pry the key item from its dead hands. And this is the advantage of it. It's almost also the tutorial for the player to actually force the player to learn how to use the key item to actually progress. And it shows, as I said, it shows the progression and foregrounds the growth of the player, because once you make your way back to the theme locked in the start, you notice, okay, now I can get past this barrier that I couldn't get past before, and then I probably can also remember that there was another place I could go to and do all those things. I am still experimenting with this thing. So I'm still, because this is just a couple of months ago that I realized that this is a very powerful structure, and starting to implement that. And I'm pretty sure that I haven't seen all the things that you can do with it, but I just thought sharing this would be a very good idea to see whatever other people make of it, and it's also a good way to bring to your attention that there's an amazing roguelike there that's using all these technologies. So thank you.
That was great. Do we have any questions from the room while the stream has a thing?
There's a question there, yeah?
I thought everything we said about all the different kinds of cycles that you can get in these types of things was really fascinating. Have you published this online, and if so, where?
Right, the question is, did I publish the cycles there? There's some of them are online. There's actually there's an article that went around to the to the point that somebody it kept on popping too much. But there's an article. If you, I'm not quite sure if it didn't put the URL in, but if you explore, you probably can find it because it's been shared 15,000 times. There are some of them there. There's also a chapter in a book on PROCJAMs that is coming out where I actually was just in time to write this. So there's places where you can find it. Any other question? Yeah.
It strikes me that this kind of cyclic movement through space creates a rhythmic experience in time.
Right.
I'm reminded also of Gaston Bachelard writing, "The rhythm of action and inaction seems to us inseparable from all knowledge of time." And I wondered if you had looked at the sort of temporal pattern that this is creating for the traversal by the player. See what I mean?
Yeah. So the question is, have I looked at the time dimensions? Because cycles create a rhythm and a sort of different type of pacing through the time. One thing I haven't mentioned that's important for pacing is important for my type of game because it's real time. So that also makes it a little bit different from the more classic roguelike, where pacing is different because it's turn based. So I have been giving it some thought, but not to the extent I think that would satisfy your question. But it's a very interesting way of looking at it that I haven't fully pursued yet. But it would be very cool because I think one of the things that that is sort of interesting for me is just the idea of that you actually you typically use cycles where you go through a cycle once, maybe 2 times, But it would be very cool if you actually force a player and get away with it in a good way to you go through a cycle maybe 3-4 times. That create a much more interesting rhythm, and you actually start foregrounding these things in more profound and interesting ways. But there's huge opportunities there. That's for sure.
I've got this was just a quick thing. Is it safe to say that this principle sort of holds true for cycles in 3D game design as well as 2D?
So the question is, does the principle hold for 2D to 3D? I would say yes, definitely. Actually, basically there was one map, the dungeon map. Where is it? This is more or less 3D, right? So because it's actually the cycles, it might be even more interesting. It might be also a lot of games. There's very few games that actually do have 3D gameplay, because that simply we're people that of a species that is bound to the earth, or we're bound to a particular plane, so that we feel more natural and at home in that way. But there is a lot of opportunities there. You can make cycles. Cycles, can even make them in the 4th dimension. That would be interesting. That's that would be cool.
So someone on stream asked, how do you deal with rewards? If you've got lots of paths or 2 paths or whatever, how do you deal with rewards in that case? Do you have to place rewards on all of the paths available? Do you allow the player to miss stuff in some cases? If you've got multiple cycles, I guess.
Yeah, well, I do. So, for example, do I need to repeat the question? Probably. Yeah. So the question is, how do you deal with rewards if people are missing out on some part of the cycle and some other not? So what I do is, if a reward is crucial, such as it's a key item, then I make sure that it's on the end point of the main cycle of that level, so that you can't miss it. But if a reward is non-critical or just a bonus reward, I can get away with the people missing it. And actually, thinking about these things in terms of cycles allows me to play around with that a little bit better and a little bit more directed, basically, in which reward to mark as critical and which not.
I really love this talk, by the way. I just wanted to say that. Just thought I'd throw that in. Right, I think that's all we've got time for. So I'll thank Joris again.